Terrific.
All right. So, um, yeah, thank you everyone that registered for being here today. I hope you and your families are safe and healthy during these crazy times that are going through right now. I'm very excited to have Rebekah Moses here with us, and we're going to talk about her career, impossible foods, and sustainable food systems. Rebekah, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm so happy I can join via Zoom. So it's great. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. So yeah, for the next 30 minutes, we're gonna have a conversation where I'm gonna start asking you a few questions, but then at the end of this conversation and at the end of the webinar, we're gonna open for a Q&A. So for the attendees, guys, just please go ahead and write your questions in the chat box. And then in the end of the webinar, I'll go ahead and read your questions to Rebekah. So I'm going to start introducing Rebekah. She leads the impact strategy at Impossible Foods, which is a company that addresses climate change and sustainable food futures through plant-based meat. Her work focuses on how product innovation and consumer behavior can maximize outcomes through business growth. And she works with several teams within Impossible Foods to integrate environmental and social aspects into the core mission of the company. So Rebekah has an unusual beginning of her career. She started in the defense industry, what later led to a focus on sustainable food systems. And following her graduate studies in international agricultural development at UC Davis, she has supported USAID, UC Berkeley, Stanford, and Cal Poly's Coastal Ecosystems Ranch. She has also worked in the intersection of ecology, agriculture, and international development, both in the Middle East and here in the USA. So I'm gonna start off with a question more focused on your career, and I would love to hear more about that beginning of your career and how starting at the defense industry led you to agricultural systems.
Absolutely, yeah. It's kind of an atypical route, I think, but something that I've noticed across the sustainability and impact strategy field is that my counterparts in other businesses, most of us have kind of an odd background. Most of us have kind of a route that is not super linear. And so in my case, I really began, I can, kind of follow it back to undergraduate, but I began my career in Middle Eastern studies, Arabic language. And as a function of that, spent a lot of time in the Middle East in places that are fairly water scarce. And so when I graduated from undergrad, I spent time working for the Department of Defense and continued kind of that exposure in places where water is a huge resilience issue. And I think there's more than some folks who aren't familiar with the field would expect. There's a lot of actual relationship between food security and between conflict and between kind of the defense world and between the development world. So the way that it ended up evolving was when I came back to the United States, I worked kind of around the defense space for a couple of years longer, but felt myself continually kind of drawn back to this idea of water policy, scarcity, resource scarcity issues, and emerging consumption trends. And I happened to get lucky in that the University of California at Davis has this really excellent program where you really can meld those two worlds of policy and environmental studies and agriculture specifically. And so that's what I wound up doing, going to UC Davis, thinking I was going to go into kind of a policy track. But what I ended up doing was becoming very, very interested in ecosystem services research and agricultural ecology. So I spent more time than I ever would have thought in fields, looking at insect populations, talking with farmers about how do you practice conservation on your working landscapes? And how do you as a grower manage for migratory bird habitat? These were kind of the questions that I wound up asking, and I wound up incorporating into thesis research while I was doing my graduate studies. From there, I continued that focus on agricultural research and on ecosystem services. So I'm guessing that this group is fairly familiar with jargon, but ecosystem services being the sort of services provided by nature that humans need to live. Things like pest control, pollination, soil stabilization, oxygen provision, and nutrient cycling. All of these things that we don't necessarily put a financial amount on, but that we do rely on. And that intact ecosystems are very, very important for, our human population, as well as all these wonderful animals. And so continuing in ecosystem services research for a number of different universities, wound up with Cal Poly at a research ranch that they own, a beautiful place in Santa Cruz County out here in California. And so while I was working, managing their agricultural research, education, and operations, it was in fact a working ranch. And so something that I just always kind of find interesting is that I came to a plant-based meat company, a company that is focused on developing alternatives to animal products from a place that produced animal products. And so it's been a useful career track, and that I've really seen the whole spectrum from the policy side and development side down to the most kind of micro level of a field. And so that's been really beneficial in having a holistic approach to crafting an impact strategy, because the mission of the company is so deeply tied to agricultural inputs, to environmental integrity, that has been remarkably helpful in the current career path that I have.
Yeah, I love hearing people's career pathways, because I think it's an amazing value to see how careers are generally not linear at all, and that's super useful to look at our own careers. I personally have a really non-linear career, so that's just something really valuable to hear. And following up, now more focus on your role at Impossible Foods today. How would you describe exactly what your role is about? And if you would name one, like the biggest challenge of your role today, what would that be?
That's a lot of question. I'm going to be a little bit long-winded. You'll have to bear with me or tell me to shut up with the words.
Go ahead.
I kind of think about my role and impact strategy at Impossible in three categories. So the first is what you would consider kind of a traditional corporate sustainability model to be, where we do obviously focus, in addition to the mission of making the food future much more sustainable, in addition to this kind of macro level approach that we have for addressing climate change and biodiversity loss through growth of our business. We also want to walk the talk and make sure that we are enacting sustainability practices and values within our own operations. So those are things like a zero waste initiative consistent with US Green Business Council for our manufacturing teams. Things like donations programming as kind of relief efforts around COVID-19. So kind of the more traditional footprint and CSR stuff. The second side of this is a little bit harder to define, and it goes back to that idea that the company that was founded, Pat Brown, Dr. Patrick Brown, is a biochemist at Stanford, and he founded Impossible Foods not because he had any innate interest in food or food manufacturing. He's a tenured professor at Stanford, but he did so because he noticed that really one of the best ways, probably the best way to move forward to create a sustainable food future was to address livestock consumption, and especially the growth of livestock consumption that we're about to see coming out of, number one, a population that's growing, but a population that is also increasingly demanding the same way that we all have for many, many years in kind of the global north, and especially in the United States, access to livestock products, whether it's dairy or meat or what have you. So the company was founded to address climate issues, was founded to address biodiversity issues associated with the emissions and land footprint that are associated with the scale of livestock systems. So all that in mind, there are different scenarios of how our whole industry can grow. And if we recognize that climate change is an urgent issue, if we recognize that we really need to find rapid and effective ways to meet the Paris Agreement or 1.5 degrees Celsius commitment, we should think about business accordingly. And in the case of Impossible Foods, a really good example is how we rolled out with a beef product. That's kind of an example of addressing worst first. So knowing, let me take a step back and just say that I would categorize this part of my work as like the research side. How do we know what the best route forward for expanding the industry would look like to maximize our impact on climate and maximize our, in a positive direction, and maximize our impact on hopefully averting catastrophic biodiversity loss through the regions that we roll out in and through the product portfolios that we roll out. Some of the way that work takes shape is addressing research questions that have not necessarily been answered before. And so if we wanted to make decisions in, you know, a 5-year future scenario where we had a choice between one region of the world and 2 different products, how can we say, all right, we're going to look at, you know, pork versus chicken, or Canada versus Thailand, to use completely arbitrary examples? Can we map those choices back to what we think the consequences will be for climate action, for biodiversity change? So knowing what the impact that livestock has on things like carbon stocks globally, knowing the impact at a regional level of biodiversity loss. Those are things that are very kind of a long-range strategic, but basically research gaps that we're trying to fill in. So the third area is really on the communication side. So supporting our communications team on how do we talk about our mission? How do we bring consumers into this idea that what they put on their plate is really important in terms of climate agency, and that basically even through small choices that you can make multiple times a day, you can position you know, entire countries for sustainable choices and for transformative change, as opposed to, you know, kind of where my area of work had historically been, like incremental yield improvements, right? So it's these ideas of structural shifts through private sector, and then how we talk about that and how we bring people in is kind of the nature of a lot of the work that I do. It's a very long elevator pitch.
Oh, that I have a lot of follow-up questions to that. And so one thing that always makes me interested in Impossible Foods and are exactly so we I heard you speaking at the Global Landscapes Forum last year in the New York Climate Week, and one of the things that you mentioned at that occasion is that so Impossible Foods has as a goal to addressing climate change and biodiversity loss and water scarcity. That is related to what you said right now. How well, at that occasion, you also mentioned that eating a Impossible burger compared to the meat-based alternative means that you're reducing the GHG emissions, your GHG footprint, by something like 90%, and you're also reducing a lot the land use that is required to produce one product versus the other. So can you tell us a little bit more about what metrics do you guys use to measure these numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that you brought up the Global Landscapes Forum talk, because it was uniquely uncomfortable in that I came on immediately after the president of the World Farming Organization, I want to say, who spent a solid 30 seconds talking about how terrible plant-based meat was. So that was fun. But to speak more toward the metrics that we use. So the way that we've gone about doing this is really a traditional life cycle assessment model. And so we can measure the positive impact that choosing an Impossible burger over a burger that's based from a cow has, based on a comparative life cycle assessment. And the outcome is that we are in comparison with a really traditional, very conventional, like feedlot system from Nebraska or Kansas. Our product uses or generates 89% fewer emissions. It uses about 96% less land to produce, and it requires about 87% less water to produce. And so that in and of itself, on a per pound basis, is about 30 pounds of greenhouse gases spared, about 300 square feet of land, and about 90 gallons of water. So in and of its, like within a 1 pound unit, that seems, it's kind of a nice footprint. When you think about the 9 billion pounds of ground beef alone that are consumed in the United States every year, it's this idea of scale and transformative shifts through private sector and through consumer choice. And that's really the heart of the business model.
Okay, cool. So yeah, keeping that life cycle assessment issue. So then my other question following up that would be, so then how do you guys track your supply chains? What kind of mechanisms do you use to track where, for example, the soy that you're using in your products are coming from? Because I agree with you 100% that beef has a huge carbon footprint, and it's one of the biggest drivers of deforestation, especially in the Amazon. But soy is also one of the big deforestation drivers. So how do you guys manage your supply chain to make sure that this, like changing from beef to soy, is actually avoiding emissions from deforestation, for example?
That's a really excellent question. So I should probably lead with what we make the burger out of, what the recipe is, because it is soy based, right? And soy has definitely been associated with expansion of with deforestation, or at least land use conversion in Brazil, especially in the Cerrado region. And I should note that largely, probably exclusively, is a result of demand for livestock feed. So very, very, very little soy that is grown globally, and only about 5% of soy that is grown in the United States actually feeds people directly. 90 to 95% of it goes to livestock feed. And the reason that the scale is so significant, the reason there's so much acreage required for soy to feed livestock, is just a simple function of metabolics. In the case of cattle, it's a cow that's alive for a year and a half, maybe more. They're walking around, they're metabolizing, they are creating things like bones, things that we don't eat, but they're also just going on with their business of being a cow. They're not specifically engineered, although we've bred them to optimize for it, to be meat, right? That wasn't like, how they kind of came into existence. So it's a long unit operation to get meat from a cow. So generally speaking, and this is consistent for a United States system, but it requires about 36 pounds of corn and soy and other types of forage to make 1 pound of beef. So the biggest thing that we can do to avoid deforestation from soy is eat a soy-based burger, because you are not using this very elaborate, long kind of unit operation that has its own metabolism and its own life to get to your plate. You're just taking a fraction of soy, you're taking the texturized soy protein in our case, and then placing that into a recipe that we mix with coconut oil, with sunflower oil, potato protein, and our heme, which is a really important ingredient for us, which we can talk about separately, but that's kind of the IP of the company, is a leg hemoglobin protein. So the fact that we're able to bypass the cow is the reason we have that level of efficiency. Now, in order for this to work, in order for us to actually avert deforestation, consumers have to choose Impossible Burger in favor of meat, right? They have to make a substitution rather than, say, supplemental. So if you're eating 3 cow-based burgers a week and then you eat 3 Impossible Burgers on top of it, I would prefer that you substitute, both for your health and also because that's kind of the vehicle that drives these sustainability changes, is displacement. So what we want to see is that by focusing on culinary and focusing on quality of the product, we can meet consumers where they're at, where they don't have to make a difficult choice. They don't have to compromise for sustainability. It's simply intrinsically part of what the product is, and we're meeting them, where their demand is coming from. So that said, I don't think I really answered your question about supply chain and traceability. We work within the system that we have. So we source commodity soy, and that's difficult to get back to a field level. So we know that we source from kind of the American soy belt. That's Iowa, Minnesota, which is where I'm from, Wisconsin to an extent, Illinois, The coconut oil comes from Southeast Asia. We have an international supply chain, although soy is domestic. Potato protein, we have sunflower oil, which I believe comes from the western, no, it's from South Dakota, North Dakota. And then heme we produce ourselves. So we know where roughly things come from. We can't trace back yet to like a farmer level, but that's something that we're always looking for ways to increase transparency of our supply chain.
Okay, awesome. And following up on something that you mentioned before about your product being having the idea of being like a substitution instead of just like an increment, then something that comes to my mind is a question about scale. So where are you guys at regarding scale of your product? How the company has grown in the past few years?
Yeah, there are a couple of milestones I think that I'll speak to. So when I joined the company, I've been here for about 4 years. And when I joined, it was just before we launched, and we launched our first recipe of the Impossible Burger. Our new recipe, our recipe that we've had since 2018 is frankly much better. With one restaurant at Momofuku Nishi in New York. So we had very limited supply. We built the brand credibility and the product credibility with a small cohort of Michelin star chefs, because who better to speak to a new product than chefs who really have high standards for these things. And then over the past 4 years, we have expanded into, we basically moved from Michelin star restaurants to better burger chains, places like Hop Dottie's or Gott's Roadside. I don't know if these chains are familiar to folks on the East Coast, but kind of sit down restaurants where you get a burger. And then we were able to expand into White Castle. So White Castle was the first real moment for us where we became super accessible. Again, I'm from Minnesota. That was a huge moment for me. I was practically raised on White Castle. I don't know if you guys have it in New Haven, but it was the first time we were in like a big quick service retail chain. And they're kind of famous for like these little slider burgers. And they're still one of our large customers. And we continued on that expansion route. Burger King came on about a year ago, and that was a national rollout with Burger King. So the second largest burger chain in America. And we saw what was really significant for me was we are priced at $1 more than a Whopper. So while in the past our price had been more of a premium, now it's coming into really more of a parity level with the animal or beef alternative. And so we're in over 15,000 restaurants now. Clearly the food system has shifted a lot in the past 2 months. And so while we have been in grocery stores on the East Coast and a few on the West Coast, so Gelson's in LA and Wegmans and Fairway on the East Coast, now we have just announced a big expansion with Safeway, which is a retailer grocery store on the West Coast, and expect more of those to follow. So we're increasingly trying to put Impossible Burger products where consumers are able to access them in our very strange, very surreal environment now. And so that's also really going to be a focus on grocery stores.
Oh, awesome. And since you started talking about the past few months, I think something that everybody's thinking about is like what's the impact of COVID-19 into the several sectors of the economy. So how did COVID-19 has already impact the company, and how do you think it would change the company afterwards?
There's a couple of things, and I think it's important to note that going into this, we got really lucky, and part of it was luck. I think part of it was strategic on our CFO's side, but we were really well capitalized when everything went sideways. So we had just raised our Series F, which is about $500 million. And so that has been, it was just tremendously good timing in a very unfortunate set of events globally. It's hard to overstate how devastating I think COVID-19 has been to communities in any sector. For us, it was a lucky happenstance that we happened to come into it with a certain amount of buffer. And it's incredibly important because we sold the vast majority of our product through food service, through restaurants, through corporate cafeterias, through corporate dining. And so it was a little bit of a wake-up call for us to realize that a huge channel of our sales has effectively either shut down or constricted dramatically. And so the shift that we're making is really, let's make sure that we are supporting our customer operators where we can. So there are a number of ways that our marketing and sales teams are trying to do that, in addition to building new outlets for consumers. I think it's important to also note that, generally speaking, the mission of the company being an environmental one, it's generally, again, what serves environmental health serves public health. And given the kind of origins of COVID-19, and it seems that for plant-based meat, there's going to be a benefit to diversifying our protein sources as a global community moving forward. Certainly, animal farming is is a hugely important part of supply chains, and finding ways to diversify that is going to build for resilience in many, many ways, I think. And this was kind of one example of where I can see a value case for plant-based meat expansion as kind of one of those additional measures or interventions that we can think about for how do we make sure that we've kind of adapted to new realities. So.
Okay, awesome. So these were the questions that I had for you, and now I'm gonna open for the Q&A. We already have a few questions here in the chat box, and please feel free to keep adding questions here. So I'm gonna read the questions in order that we got them. So there is one first question about the ingredients of the Impossible Burger, but I think we already talked a little bit about that, so I might just skip that one. The second question is, the consumption of meat is decreasing in the developed world, but has seen an astronomical demand growth in developing nations such as India. At present, Impossible Foods products are meant for developed countries, requiring refrigeration, high-income consumers, etc. Are there any plans to enter into developing markets or investing there?
That's a good question. That's an excellent question. There are plans for emerging markets or rather developing world specifically, because we want to be everywhere. We want plant-based meat to be available everywhere, and we want high quality plant-based options to be available everywhere. So the point about emerging economies having really high levels or rather increasing levels of consumption of livestock products is a very good one. And I think it's a non-starter to ask that people just don't eat these things. I think it's very difficult for, especially us sitting in the United States, to go, oh, well, you shouldn't, but we already did, sorry. We broke it, you can't have it. What we need is better alternatives, and that's on industry. That's on groups like Impossible Foods to figure that out. Now, we're a company of about 600 people right now. We are still relatively small, and we chose to focus expansion on the United States and to an extent, cities in Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Macau, and we plan on continued international expansion. Asia in particular is super important for environmental goals and for making sure you're kind of leapfrogging some of these negative externalities associated with increasing livestock consumption. So I love the call out for refrigeration needs and for pricing. On the pricing side, we plan on being at parity in the future, and I can't say when, but the intent is to be at parity with commodity beef, which is very, very cheap. We aren't there yet. We need to continue building our business. We're still pre-profit, we're still a venture-backed company, but the intent is to get there, and there's a roadmap for that. Now, the developing world has sort of a unique use case in that, yes, there's a kind of cold chain constraint associated with certain types of expansion. The interesting thing about plant-based meat, and I'm speaking hypothetically now, not to any direct plans that we have, is that plant-based meat, number one, has a flexible recipe. You can use any number of high-quality proteins, high-quality fats and oils, high-quality functional carbohydrates to build these recipes in a way that can be regionally relevant. So in the United States, we're using soy. That's, I think, if you were to look at a market in Lebanon. There's no reason that we wouldn't be able to adapt something for chickpeas or for locally abundant crops, and that's true globally. We actually have some projects that we're working on right now with NGO partners, kind of looking at some of those scenarios. The other aspect of that is that everything that goes into our product can be kind of assembled on site in some way. So I'm simplifying this hugely, but we're basically talking about vegetable proteins, fats, and again, like functional carbohydrates, but plant-based ingredients that don't necessarily need refrigeration until they are formed and until water has been added to them. So if our industry, and I'm not saying Impossible Foods necessarily, but if the plant-based sector can figure out ways that you have kind of on-site assembly and regional assembly, I think that there's opportunities to avoid these constraints that we would have in normal cold chain distribution. All of this is hypothetical, but there are things that we've discussed internally about making sure that these products can be relevant no matter where you are.
And yeah, and I think you already answered part of the follow-up to the question. I'm going to read the question. So if yes to expansion, to what you're talking about, in developing markets, has there been any discussions about sourcing of ingredients and how to maintain same standards for environmental impact among suppliers? So I think you kind of talked about that, but has been anything specifically with suppliers and policies within the company to make sure that the supply chain keeps the same level of same standard?
In terms of the environmental standards, it's similar with our health standard. We made a commitment early on in the business to say that we are never going to commercialize and offer a product that is not as healthy or more healthy from a nutritional standpoint than the incumbent animal product. That's the same for environmental. We're not going to ever, especially with beef, we would have to be trying really hard to make it less sustainable than beef. I'm not even sure how we'd manage it. Just because of that metabolic efficiency issue. So those things will be consistent regardless of where we expand to. In terms of like, on the ground plans, we don't have those for developing world right now, but it's super important. And I think I should note also that there are other companies in places that we are not currently operating, in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, that are sub-Saharan African companies that are creating plant-based alternatives. And there are existing kind of aspects of cuisine that could be considered, soy chunks, for example, could be considered meat alternatives. There's a company in Lagos, Nigeria that has a lot of success with wheat gluten as an alternative. So we're not the only actors out here, and there is growth in regions that haven't necessarily received the amount of media attention that a company coming out of Silicon Valley has.
Okay, awesome. And we just got a heads up from Professor Marin Cherchild that we had a White Castle in the corner of here in New Haven. So just to add that. And so the next question
there, that would have been all
so jumping to our next question. It was already answered, but I'm gonna just double check with you. It says, I love Impossible Burgers, but I have always been curious to know where the hemoglobin protein that makes it so special comes from, and what's its impact.
Yeah, bear with me. I'm gonna talk some science at a high level, but hemoglobin or leg hemoglobin is the protein that we use as an ingredient, and that is a naturally occurring protein. Heme is a small iron-carrying molecule. It's found in every living organism. The protein that wraps around that molecule differs by species, but heme is really highly abundant in mammalian blood cells, in things like red meat. And so early on, Pat being our CEO and founder, being a biochemist, he and the initial research team had this hypothesis that it was going to be extremely important to find that and to get a vegan or vegetarian, a non-animal-based version of that in order to create a compelling alternative to meat. Because if you can't include that, you're missing a huge amount of the culinary attributes of that product. And so after a lot of scientific testing and a lot of culinary testing, they did confirm that this heme molecule is really important to the way that beef in particular cooks, tastes, smells. It's responsible for the Maillard reaction. So when you're cooking a pink patty of ground beef, it starts turning brown and crisping. That's heme driving that Maillard reaction. So we obviously couldn't get it from animals. We had a number of different options for how to figure that out, but what they landed on was leg hemoglobin protein. So similar to hemoglobin in your blood, similar to myoglobin, but derived from the root nodules of soy plants. It's any leguminous plant. Any plant that fixes its own nitrogen has root nodules with this protein inside. Now, agronomically speaking, harvesting that would be an absolute nightmare. You'd have to tear up the soil profile. There's just no way to make it cost effective or even sustainable. You'd lose a bunch of soil carbon. And so what the R&D team did was, basically, I think about it like they tricked a yeast strain into thinking that it was the root nodule of a soy plant. So we grow yeast in basically fermentation, kind of like beer, and the yeast expresses the heme protein. We can then isolate the heme protein, and when you isolate it, it basically looks like blood. Super, super interesting, but that's the non-animal based version of heme that we were able to create, and it's a big part of our intellectual property, and it's one of the key differentiators for our product.
Okay, awesome, thank you. So the next question is, you mentioned that Impossible Burger or Impossible Foods is tackling worse first. What's next on your to-do list?
We have a whole number of prototypes in the lab. So our technology platform for figuring out how to reverse engineer meat and dairy products and recreate them from plants is kind of broadly applicable across different food categories. So we have things like fish prototypes. We have things like eggs, dairy, any number of different animal options. We've already done kind of a first taste of a sausage and kind of pork-based product that was at the Consumer Electronics Show last year. And so definitely stay tuned for more products that are equally environmentally impactful, but maybe in different ways.
And is there should we expect to see these products in the market in the next year or the next few years? What's more or less the timeline?
Things are weird right now, given COVID-19, but I would expect within the next year you will see a launch from us at a significant scale.
Okay, cool. And another question related to COVID-19. To what extent do you think COVID-19 will bring attention from governments, regulators, consumers, etc., to animal welfare and animal rights issues, and thereby shift purchasing away from animal-based products?
Yeah, I think the important thing here is looking at the demand side, right? And kind of noting that demand for animal protein, however it is that manifests, whether it's a wildlife market or a wet market, or whether it's industrial farming, it drives a series of risk factors when it comes to zoonotic outbreaks, or rather spillovers when it transfers from animals to humans. It just creates the kind of situations in which those risks arise. So diversification of protein sources, especially as the population grows, is going to be really important, that we make sure that plants have a very, very high fraction of that portfolio. I can't speak directly to animal welfare or animal rights, other than to note that I think, there's been a lot of focus in the popular media that I've seen that I don't 100% understand, really, on like the culinary choices that are unique to, southern China. I don't think that that's really where we should be focusing. I think what we should be focusing on is demand for animal protein and finding alternatives to that, rather than kind of like, shaming different culinary systems. Clearly poaching is an issue. Clearly we should not be, selling wildlife in cages. But let's look at that as an industry, maybe from a demand side perspective, is something that I would suggest. I don't know that the direct correlation is going to necessarily be made, in the same way that I don't always see a huge, personally, as someone who works in the space, I would like to see more recognition of the role that our food choices and animal farming in particular plays in environmental issues. I think this might be a similar phenomenon where there's too many there's too many kind of unit operations to trace back for the average consumer to kind of have an understanding of, okay, this means maybe this means maybe this, and these kind of chains of events, and understanding ecology and the dynamics of food production is not necessarily simple if you're not coming from this background. Mm-hmm. So I don't expect that it's going to be a hugely salient point in conversation, and I'm speaking purely from my own subjective understanding of what I've seen in the media right now. I would hope that it gets a little bit more attention broadly, kind of the issue of eating animals. But I don't know that it's going to be the dominant driver of the conversation. And for that reason, I think it's especially important that industry continues to roll out alternatives to animal farming and to animal consumption in general.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting answer, and I think I would agree with you. I think the complexity of supply chains is something that is so far from the general consumer that not necessarily everything that's happened is gonna really drive change as directly that we would hope for. Mm-hmm. But yeah, at the same time, we're all gonna see how that's gonna play out in the next few months or in the next few years. So it's interesting to see that happening. Okay, I'm gonna move on. We have a bunch of questions here still. Do you foresee collaboration between Impossible Foods and Cell Culture Meat? How does the mission of Impossible Foods relate to plant-based meat versus other kinds of alternative proteins?
It's a good differentiation to call out, and I think there's a lot of confusion between what the difference is. And so in the case of Impossible Foods, as I kind of mentioned, there's a lot of science and a lot of lab work that goes into understanding what makes meat meat. But then when it comes to manufacturing and our recipe, it's a bunch of plant proteins and fats squished together in a bottle mixer. It's more complex than that, but basically that's what it breaks down to. With cellular agriculture, or sometimes called clean meat, sometimes called like bioag, there's all kinds of names for it. But that is more, it's kind of how I refer to Heme, where you're producing things in fermentation vats. They're doing that for the whole animal product. So that's what they're doing. They're growing in kind of cell culture, actual mammalian meat, but they're doing it not using an animal, except for the biological feedstock. So it's not our business model. If that's something that can scale sustainably and cost effectively, more power to them. I really value any approach that is reducing demand on animal products in general. It's not our particular model, but it's something that I think definitely has promise.
Okay, yeah, and also thinking about Impossible Foods as like a tech company and a food tech company, and how the market is gonna also have more companies that are focusing in tech food. That's gonna be also interesting to see how that cellular research is gonna go from now too.
There's companies that are 3D printing steaks. There's a whole wild west out there that we'll see how it scales.
Yeah, that's mind blowing. Okay, yeah, no, that's very, very interesting to think about. So the next question is about veganism. It says that veganism is fundamental to your business strategy, but also incredibly challenging proposition to the average American. Do Impossible and your competitors see a role in mass persuasion as part of the marketing strategies?
We do not rely on changing consumer minds or changing consumer behavior. Our model is to meet consumers where they're at. So our primary market is actually not vegans, because vegans are certainly already eating sustainably by choosing plant-based options. What we're trying to do is introduce sustainable options that are vegan, that are plant-based, but to carnivores, to omnivores, without necessarily having to rely on some kind of cognitive shift. We're not asking them to change their minds about food. We're simply providing an alternative that is more environmentally sustainable. And so that's how we're engaging with it. That said, we're in a really unique time right now where the sheer amount of attention, especially before the kind of COVID-19 outbreak, that we've seen on climate action, Greta Thunberg, climate strikes, youth protests. There's so much more momentum and awareness around climate in general. And we have seen that shift also sort of percolate into consumer food choices to an extent, not hugely, but people are becoming more and more aware, especially younger generations, about the planetary impacts of the food that they put on their plate. And so to the extent that we can help message the climate issues are urgent, this is a tool for that, we're definitely doing that, but we're never really seeking to change a consumer's mind. We're trying to meet them with our product.
Okay, awesome. So it's already 1 o'clock, and I want to be mindful of your time, but could we do one last question?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, awesome. So you mentioned that growing beef requires a large weight ratio of soybeans to meet. Are you able to comment on that ratio for the Impossible Burger? How efficiently are you able to derive texture, soy protein, and heme from soybeans?
Yeah, it's so the heme is a very small part of our total recipe, and so heme, the waste associated is any kind of the water inputs that go into it and then extraction, which for our whole footprint is quite small. Now, it's a really good question around what the efficiency of our product is. And we can estimate based on our knowledge of the supply chain, which is that it's never going into an animal, so we don't have a metabolic loss. What you might see are areas of manufacturing or process loss. So let's look at soy as it's just kind of a good example for that. You harvest it from the field, probably comes off of a field in Iowa in our case. It goes into a grain silo. From there, it goes to milling and processing. And at any one of those points, you can lose a little bit of the crop due to quality issues, due to just kind of process waste. Let's say 2-3% for an efficient manufacturer. But that's about it. So other than these kind of standard areas of loss that you'd see through processing, there's no area within our supply chain, or there's no step where you would see these kind of high magnitude efficiency losses just because we don't go through an animal. And so it's not perfectly one-to-one. One bean does not translate to exactly zero loss by the time it turns into an Impossible Burger, but the loss is very marginal. The reason I can't make the same direct quantitative comparison is because those figures come from a study that did a big life cycle assessment of animal farming. And so it used a very specific methodology that we have not applied to our direct process. But generally speaking, very minimal losses.
Okay, awesome. So we still have a whole bunch of very good questions that we won't be able to get to. But yeah, I wanted to thank you so much, Rebekah, for joining us today. And it was really a nice conversation that we had, and very stoked that so many people attended and there were so many good questions. So thank you so much again for your time, and it was really nice talking to you.
Likewise, thank you so much. I had a great time. Thanks for the great questions.
All right, so thank you and have a good one. Bye.
Bye.